As expected, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas today requested formal membership for the Palestinians in the United Nations. Both the United States and Israel opposed the move, with the U.S. saying the request would be met by a veto in the Security Council. Joining us on the phone is the former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Dore Gold. Mr. Ambassador, welcome to Bottom Line. Thanks for your time today.
It's my great pleasure.
Sir, even before President Abbas made that announcement today, the United States had already said that it would veto the Palestinian application for statehood. Israel says that by acting unilaterally, President Abbas has subverted the peace process. But for all intents and purposes, didn't those talks break down 3 years ago when Israel went to war in the Gaza Strip?
Well, I mean, you could say the talks broke down when the Hamas launched rockets into Israeli cities from the Gaza Strip and forced 1 million Israelis to sit in their shelters. Regardless of the cause, Israel has been trying to restart those peace talks over the last number of years, and unfortunately the Palestinian side has now placed preconditions on starting those peace talks, which never existed before when the two sides met.
The Palestinians say that they won't return to the bargaining table without assurances that Israel will halt settlement building and drop its opposition to basing negotiations on the borders it held before capturing the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza back in 1967. But Israel's concern is that a return to the 67 borders would expose it to attack from the West Bank. With both sides dug in, is there even any room for negotiation or compromise at this point?
Well, ultimately, there's going to have to be a compromise, but you can't put as a precondition for negotiations agreement on the borders that you have to negotiate over. It's just unrealistic. And therefore, both Israel and the United States take the position that the parties should come back to negotiations without prior conditions and get to the business of reaching an agreement. It's going to be difficult. It may take a while, but with patience and perseverance, it can be done. The problem is that if you say that Israel must accept the 67 lines, nobody really understands what that means. It sounds very abstract. But it would mean that Jerusalem would be divided. It would mean that the old city and the Western Wall, the Temple Mount, would be in Palestinian hands. That's not something Israel's going to agree to. So, one of the first arts of diplomacy is not putting forward a peace proposal that is completely unacceptable to the other side. And that's unfortunately what Abbas was doing when he grandstanded in the UN General Assembly today.
Mr. Ambassador, I believe it was the late Prime Minister Golda Meir who once said, "Don't be so humble, you're not that great." So taking that as a backdrop, what do Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu have to do to try to forge some sort of lasting peace? At the very least, what do they need to do to get back to the negotiating table?
Well, we've had this whole buildup for what's called the Palestinian unilateral move at the UN. And now that they've done their thing, we have to figure out how to pull back, and now without the UN and without all the global media around, go back to the Middle East and sit down and talk. If we can do that, I think we can reach certain agreements. It's going to be a very difficult negotiation, but we have to engage in the art of the possible, and that means identifying areas where agreement can be reached and putting off till later areas where perhaps the gaps are too wide.
Sir, in our last minute, does the art of the possible include Hamas?
Well, the problem is Hamas is the art of the impossible. I mean, Hamas is an organization which calls for the destruction of Israel. Plain and simple. I wish it was otherwise. You read their charter, and they've even been asked, are you renouncing your charter? They say, no, we're not going to change a single word. So I don't see Hamas becoming part of a peace process any more than I would think that al-Qaeda could be part of a peace process. They both come out of the same roots. Mr.
Ambassador, what role does the quartet have in this? Is this something where they're going to have to be an outside observer, and this can only get accomplished when Israeli and Palestinian officials sit across the table from each other? I guess what I'm asking is, are there times when maybe the quartet is a hindrance?
Well, you know how the quartet got invented? It was because when President George W. Bush needed the support of Europeans for the Iraq war, they insisted on having a role to play in the peace process. So the quartet was invented as part of the buildup for the Iraq War. Whether the quartet is fully necessary, sometimes they can say things that are helpful. Sometimes there are quartet statements that are less than helpful. Yep. Hopefully, we'd like to see them provide the kind of support necessary to make negotiations work.
Sir, will there be a Palestinian state living side by side in peace next to Israel?
Well, Israel's prepared to consider that as a real possibility, but it's going to require the Palestinians to come back to reality and sit with Israel and work out arrangements that we can both live with, and not just come to the UN and try and multilateralize the entire relationship with us.
Sir, before I let you go, Prime Minister Netanyahu, are he and President Abbas going to meet on the sidelines here in New York? I know the Prime Minister suggested it as much when he spoke to the General Assembly. His quote was, "I hope you will grasp my hand."
Well, that was a very tangible proposal that Prime Minister Netanyahu made. I mean, here they are. They're both in the same town. They're both in the same building in New York City. Well, why can't they have an hour-long negotiating session and then say, to be continued? That was the proposal he made. Let's hope that Mahmoud Abbas, picks up the challenge and the two of them can get started.
The former Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, Dore Gold, joining us via phone. Mr. Ambassador, thanks for your time. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.